So now I want to turn it over to Ben Martin, CAE founder of The Nerd, who's going to talk to us today about the association technology consolidation and how to protect your organization's interests. So I'll turn it over to you, Ben.
Okay, great. Can you hear me, Kevin?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Ben Martin. I am founder of thenerd.org, and as Kevin was mentioning in his opening remarks there, disruption is kind of a fact of life, and to the extent that associations are disrupting their own operations, we think is a good thing. It's the best way to get to innovation. But with the recent surge in money that's been flowing into our association's technology market, you may feel like you're getting disrupted just a bit. So today's webinar is all about how to protect your organization's interest in light of the fact of all the money that is now flowing into this market. So let's talk a little bit about what exactly the NERD is. So the NERD stands for the Not-for-Profit Investments Research Department. I got interested in this topic of investments that are coming into our market about a year and a half ago when one of the vendors that I had recommended to several of my clients was acquired. This took me quite by surprise. As a matter of fact, my jaw was just about on the floor when I found out that this company had been acquired because I was good friends with the founder of this company, and I thought for sure he would give me a heads up before anything like this were to happen. But what I came to find out after doing some research into investments and mergers and acquisitions is that that's not going to happen. You're not going to get a heads up before a merger or acquisition happened. And so this really sparked my interest in this topic. And so the reason I founded this site was to help really to track all of this merger, acquisition, and investment activity that has been taking place in the association market. Our mission really is to educate you guys on the effects of high finance on your organization, your constituents, whether they're members, volunteers, and also the staff and the leaders of these organizations. And on this website, thenerd.org, we publish news, analysis, rumors of deals that may be happening, and also opinion on the investments that are happening in this market. So let's just talk a little bit about how much money and who the players are in all these mergers and acquisitions, consolidations that have been going on over the past over the past year. And really, this has been going on for many, many years, but it does seem that the pace has been quickening recently, which is one of the reasons, again, that I founded thenerd.org was, if these mergers and acquisitions are quickening, let's help people keep track of that. So this graphic basically shows all of the investments that have happened since July of last year. So MemberClicks received a big round of funding and went on to acquire an event registration company called ePly. So MemberClicks and ePly have now become the same company. Over on the right side of the screen, you'll see HireLogic. HireLogic acquired Covey and Socius within the past year. They received a $55 million round of growth funding back at the end of 2016, which had allowed them to then fund the acquisitions of Covey and Socius. Kind of the big player right now is a umbrella company called Community Brands, which has now pulled together Your Membership, Abilla, Aptify, and Nimble. All of these companies now exist under the umbrella company of Community Brands, but also keep in mind that Your Membership has over the years acquired Affinescape, Digital Ignite, which is a learning management system, and they've also acquired JobTarget, which obviously is a job board. So there are about 6 or 7 companies that now exist underneath the Your Membership brand, but also keep in mind that Abilla actually is the successor company to the old Sage nonprofit fund accounting and other fundraising softwares, and Avectra. So, I mean, really at the end of the day, you're looking at about 10 different companies that now exist underneath the Community Brands family. IMIS also took a round of growth funding at the end of last year. Actually, just yesterday, they announced the acquisition of an Australia-based AMS called IVT. So they're building their empire, and really IMIS has been in the market, as you know, for a long, long time, has made probably dozens of acquisitions over their history. NumberSuite is kind of an interesting one. They're a venture capital-backed AMS, and they took somewhere in the neighborhood of about $15 to $20 million in VC funding last year. And lastly, on the screen here, we've got Blue Sky eLearn. They accepted some funding. Don't know how much. That amount was not disclosed, but they took some funding from Freeman, which, as you probably are aware, is one of the big event services company in the markets. So these are all the companies that have kind of been wrapped up in the investment activity since July of 2016. And by the way, that full number adds up to about $700 million. And really, that's only what we were able to find out there, like whether it's been published or whether we've gotten this information from a reliable source. I personally happen to think that the number is probably in excess of $1 billion over the past year. And, you know, other people who are kind of in the know have echoed those sentiments that we're probably talking about a number that now is up into 10 figures, and that's just in the past year. So this webinar is all about protecting your organization, and rather than save the bullet points for how you can actually do this for the end of our webinar, I'm going to go ahead and give them to you right now. The first one is, in order to really protect your organization in this age of quickening investments, mergers, acquisitions, and consolidations, I think it's really important for you to be attending your user conference, and so that you know and you can get from leadership some clues at the very least, if not some outright information about what's happening with respect to mergers and acquisitions. So attending your user conferences is really helpful because you can hear directly from leadership and even corner your leadership and say, hey, what's going on? Are you guys looking to be acquired? Are you looking to make acquisitions? And at least you can hear directly from the horse's mouth about those plans. Next is, it's really important to know multiple people at your software vendors. A lot of organizations, in my experience, have this one support rep that they contact constantly. And in an age of mergers and acquisitions, we see that the tendency for there to be some turnover increases after a merger or an acquisition. And again, this varies from company to company, but on the whole, what we notice is that after a merger, acquisition, consolidation, or investment, there is an increase in the amount of staff turnover, whether that's voluntary or involuntary. So it's really important for you to know multiple people within the organizations that you do business with, so that when there is turnover, and it's really inevitable, like you can't count on a support rep or anybody staying at a vendor forever, it's really important to know multiple people. One of the big things that happens after an acquisition, and again, this doesn't happen all the time, but we do see a pattern that after a merger or acquisition, investment, or consolidation, sometimes there is a disruption in customer service. And we think it's really important for you not to tolerate any lapse in service. So if you're seeing that your tickets aren't being responded to as quickly as they used to, if you're having trouble getting resolution to items, and if those troubles increase, we think it's really important for you to complain loudly and at the highest levels that, look, I understand that you're running a business, that there was a merger or an acquisition, that there might be some confusion right now, but my mission cannot suffer the consequences of this merger or acquisition. This is your problem, not mine. Get this fixed, and be very vehement, be loud, complain at the highest levels. If you have to, get your CEO involved. But we think it's really important not to tolerate any lapse in service. Again, your mission should not suffer the ill effects of a merger or acquisition, even if it is chaotic on your vendor's side. Next is put your contract cancellation windows on your calendar. Know when you can get out of your contract. If you're having any inkling that you want to get out, you need to know when that window is. So put that on your calendar and make sure that you stay up to date on that. And really, kind of the crux of today's webinar is stay informed about M&A and investment activity in your sector. And again, I would like to encourage you to subscribe to The Nerd. If you go to thenerd.org, you'll see very prominently on the right-hand side a spot where you can subscribe to get updates on what's happening in the market. And also, today's webinar is, and again, the crux of this webinar today is to get you informed on exactly what does it mean when mergers and acquisitions, investments, and consolidations happen in the industry. What are the ramifications? And really just kind of understanding the whole ecosystem of M&A and investment activity. And that's what the rest of our webinar today is about. So you probably heard me say over the past couple minutes here the word high finance a few times. And really what high finance means is, like, what's the financial model behind the companies that you do business with? And that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of today's webinar. We'll talk about the attributes of the different ways that companies are financed and how that really affects their operations. So there are really four versions of high finance, or four financial models that the companies that you do business with today are funded. The first one is privately held. Like, this could be singularly owned, like one person owns it, or a family-owned business. This is really the primary way that most of the vendors in the association sector are financed. Typically, they're privately held companies. For example, IMAS is actually a privately held company. Even though they've received some equity funding, they are actually a privately held company. But you can also think of smaller organizations. One that comes to mind for me is Matrix Group. They run the Matrix Max AMS. That's a privately held company. Then we have private equity backed. And really there are two versions of private equity, and we'll get to those in a minute. But there's basically minority and majority investments, or private equity, and we'll get to those in a minute. Next up, I mentioned, for example, Member Suite is a venture capital backed. We'll talk about those in a minute. And then finally, we have publicly traded companies. And actually, these are a very small minority of companies that operate in our space. Most companies that operate in the association space are not publicly traded companies. We're going to spend very little time on those. So let's talk about some of the attributes of a privately held company. And again, I'm going to lead and create the caveat here that these companies tend to look like this, or tend to operate like this. This is not a hard and fast rule, but on the whole, privately held companies tend to have less access to capital. And if you think about this practically speaking, a privately held company is basically backed by one individual or a group of individuals, like a family-owned company. And these companies just tend to have less access to capital. They could go out and get a loan, but with some of these private equity backed or venture capital backed, you're talking about multiple millions of dollars that are flowing into that company at any given time when there's an investment made. They also tend to have a high-touch relationship with their clients, especially if you think about small family-owned businesses. I can think of companies that I've done business with before where I actually have the cell phone number of the owner of that company, and I can text that person or call them on their cell phone and get a very quick response. But these privately held, small family-owned businesses, again, tend to have a high-touch relationship with their clients. Because of this, they tend to be perceived as more service-oriented. Again, with that high-touch relationship, they tend to be perceived, anyway, as more service-oriented. And they tend to be motivated by whatever motivates the owners. So, if the owner has an affinity for a certain charity or for a certain sector of the association economy, they might be more oriented towards that aspect of the business. Next up, we have private equity backed. These guys tend to, again, I'm going to put the caveat out there, it's not always the case, but they tend to have access to more capital. So if they want to fund some kind of major initiative, let's say I need to totally redo the code base, they have access in most cases to dip down into a round of funding and say, all right, I'm going to spend $20 million so I can rewrite my code base over the course of the next 6 months. For that reason, they tend to have a quicker R&D cycle than, and especially for big projects, than a privately held company would. Frankly, they tend to have periodic episodes of uncertainty whenever a new round of funding is taken in, and that period tends to be in the space of every 4 to 7 years, and we'll talk more about this, this rhythm as we make our way further into the presentation. And they also tend to be driven by the motivations of the investors. So less so than the management, because private equity funds, and these are investors that have to be paid back, and the investors take a degree of control over these companies when they make investments, they tend to be driven more by the motivations of the investors than of, say, ownership or management in a privately held company. Venture capital backed, again, these guys tend to also have more access to capital than a privately held company. Again, because they're taking in multiple millions of dollars with each round of funding, they have access to a lot more money than a privately held company, for example. Now, you probably heard about venture capital because it's very prominent in Silicon Valley and it tends to make the headlines a lot. And really, venture capitalists look at companies as a high-risk, high-reward effort or investment strategy. I've heard owners of venture capital-backed companies say they expect only 1 out of 10 of their investments to really pay off, but it's going to pay off, 50 times, whereas the others, they might just break even or they might actually lose their investment. So for this reason, venture capital companies tend to be perceived as more risky than the alternatives. Again, if the investors are thinking, hey, only 10% of my investments are really going to pay off here, as a customer, you've got to look at these companies as well and say, gosh, if the investors are only thinking 1 out of 10 is going to survive or really thrive, how am I to think that my vendor, as a VC-backed company, is like, why am I to think that this one is going to have a great degree of success if the investors don't even think that? Again, they also are driven by the motivations of the investors more so than, say, a privately held company. And we're going to just kind of gloss over publicly traded here, but again, because there's so few of them in our market, again, they have access to lots of capital because they're traded on a stock exchange where they can go and do IPOs and so on and so forth. They tend to be viewed as a safe bet because, again, once you get to that level where you're publicly traded, you've kind of made it from the perspective of investors. You've now gotten to the point where you're a $100 million organization or a $500 million organization, so they can be viewed as a safe bet. And again, because they're owned by shareholders, they tend to be driven by the motivations of the investors. So let's dig down into private equity because this is the version of investing that's getting a lot of attention right now in the association market. So basically, private equity these are institutional investors. So you might think about endowments at major universities or foundations or pension plans for teachers or firefighters. These institutional investors pool their money and are expecting an ROI on their investment of 4 to 7 times what they put in within a 4 to 7 year time frame. And these are rules of thumb, like these are not strict. These shouldn't be interpreted strictly. These are just kind of the rules of thumb that these private equity investors are looking for 4 to 7 times their ROI. So whatever they put in, they want 4 to 7 times back. And typically they want that ROI within a 4 to 7 year period. And so that's why earlier you said, I mentioned that private equity backed companies tend to have a periodic episodes of uncertainty whenever these investments are received, because again, every 4 to 7 years, you have to know that another investment is coming. Some key terms here, there's a thing known as a private equity fund. This is where the pensions, the foundations, and the endowments pool all their money into these big funds that then get allocated out to make investments. But there's also this thing called a private equity firm. And so basically what the private equity firm does is they manage the pool of money. And they're the ones who actually make the investments every 4 to 7 years. And then we also have these things that I mentioned earlier called majority and minority investments. So we're going to dig into these and talk about those in more detail. So let's talk first about majority investments. So a majority investment basically means, look, I have basically purchased management rights. Like I've bought into the point that I now control the majority of the stakeholders, the majority of the board of this company. And so I'm going to, as a private equity firm here, I'm going to basically call the shots for this company, as opposed to a minority investment that we'll talk about in a minute, where the owners basically maintain control of the company. So the first change in ownership tends to be pretty rocky because, again, you're taking it from a privately held company to one that's now majority owned effectively by the investors. And really, I mean, more accurately or more practically, I guess I should say, the private equity firm has control, has taken control of the company. So, initially there's a lot of confusion for the customers and the staff. Typically there's some turnover. People will either opt out or there'll be a reduction in force among the staff, and so there's a lot of confusion. But the good news is, in the long term, typically the product is vastly improved. One of the big reasons that companies take on private equity funding is they just can't afford to burn down their R&D list at a pace that they would like to. And really, the number one objective of private equity firms is to improve the product so that it sells better. Obviously, they want to make their 4 to 7 times ROI in a short period of time. They want to burn down that R&D list, improve the product, and really what we typically see is after a year or two, this period of confusion goes away and the product tends to improve dramatically. But again, you have to realize that eventually this company is going to be sold off to another investor. It could go back to being privately held. It could be transferred to another private equity firm. It could be taken public. But at some point, typically about 4 to 7 years down the line, there's another investor, and there may be, again, some periods of adjustment or uncertainty when that happens. So here are some of the implications of that. I think we may have already touched on these, but you have to assume or think that there may be a new CEO appointed. The staff turnover tends to increase during this period. Oftentimes you'll see new processes introduced. So one of the big things that we see is, especially when we go from privately held to a private equity backed company, you might see big changes in how customer support is delivered. But again, your product should improve over the long term, and you should again expect that within 4 to 7 years you'll probably see another turnover in ownership. So now let's talk about minority investments. And my personal opinion is that these tend to be some of the best ways, one of the best outcomes if your company does receive an investment. On a personal level, I think this is kind of the best way that companies get funded. So typically the owners are going to get a big payday. They'll go out and buy a Tesla or a Ferrari, but they're still the owners, but they are now influenced by the investors. So again, if they take a minority investment and let's just say it's a 25% stake, these investors do receive some oversight of the company, but the owners still, at the end of the day, are really in charge. They get the benefits of the increased capital, but with fewer of the challenges of a change in ownership. But again, you have to realize these guys have to get paid back. So at the end of 4 to 7 years, either the owners will pay out the investors, or again, they might take another round of private equity funding to pay back the investors. There's a lot of different ways that the investors get paid back. You do have to realize that they're subject to the same 4 to 7 year cycle. So here are the implications there. The CEO is more likely to remain in place, which is good, like it creates more stability. In these cases, you're likely to see a lot of new staff, like they might staff up, but the likelihood of turnover, in my experience, is a little bit lower than when a majority investor comes in. Again, your product should improve. That's one of the major objectives of any private equity investor, is to vastly improve the product. But again, you have to realize that within 4 to 7 years, you're probably going to see some turnover. So my point in all this was try to give you a sense for what's the rhythm and what happens after an investment, whether it's private equity, VC, or what are the attributes of these different types of companies. So hopefully you've been informed on what those things are and what the attributes of a privately held, VC-backed, private equity-backed, both flavors, majority and minority investments, and then also publicly traded, which we've really kind of glossed over. So I think I'll just close today by saying, look, I'm doing this thing on the Nerd. I don't have any business model behind this. I'm doing it because I care about the association industry and the people who are buying products and services from these vendors. I think that association people need to understand what the various implications of the different financial models are that these companies employ, so that you can make educated decisions about the software that you buy. My real job is I'm the Chief Engagement Officer at Online Community Results, and I help organizations like yours use private online communities like HireLogic, Socius, Small World Labs to basically keep and get new members. So if you have any challenges around online communities, I'd love to chat with you. But this thing that I'm doing at the Nerd is kind of a hobby, and so I just wanted to give myself a quick plug as the sole proprietor of Online Community Results, and let you know that that's what I do in my real job. So we're right at the top of the hour here, but I think I've got time to take questions if there are any that have come in.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, so we do have a minute or two for some questions. We can, you guys can use the little chat bubble up here to submit your questions. And in the meantime, Ben, I want to revisit something you said earlier in your presentation. And, why does it seem like we as customers are always the last to know about these deals? You mentioned it a little bit in the beginning, but why is that?
Yeah, so I mean, the main reason for that is that when a deal is about to go down, it all has to be shrouded in secrecy. Oftentimes the employees don't even know about an investment or a merger or an acquisition until the day that the deal goes down. And I don't fully understand the reasons why, but at the end of the day, the fact of the matter is that if you talk about the deal as the owner of the company before the deal goes down, the entire deal is threatened and may not happen at all. And clearly, as the owner of that company or as an investor in that company, you want to make sure that the deal happens. And so it does not get talked about until it's done. So, I don't fully understand the reasons why, but what I think people on the phone need to know is that, look, the whole process is kind of shrouded in secrecy until it's a done deal. And, the phrase, loose lips sink ships definitely applies in this scenario.
Okay, thanks, Ben. So another question is, do you think the pace of all these investments is going to speed up or slow down or be the same?
Yeah, so I don't see it slowing down. What I've heard is that there's a lot of money on the sidelines. It's kind of an interesting question right now because, the stock market hit an all-time high yesterday. And at the same time, we've kind of seen the pace of investment slow over the past 3 months. There was a lot of activity through April of this year, and then things kind of slowed down recently. I'm not sure if that's because we're now into the dog days of summer and people are vacationing. Maybe there were a lot of investments made over the past, let's just say, from between November and April, and maybe the money has dried up. Maybe more of those institutional investors are now looking to the stock market again since it's been rallying. But on the whole, I would say I would expect that we'll see about the same level, if not more. The trajectory seems to be upwards, but we do seem to have hit a little lull. I'm wondering with the big ASAE annual meeting coming up next month, if we might not see a few more deals announced over the coming weeks or maybe at the annual meeting.
Okay. And also with all this consolidation, should I be concerned that, there might be a monopoly coming and my choices of solutions are going to be more narrow and get like the airlines where now you only have a few, choices to choose from?
Yeah, so I mean, especially when you look at community brands, you'll notice that they have pulled together basically like a full suite of services that, an organization can go to community brands and basically choose lots of different solutions to basically run their whole operation. And, larger organizations larger associations may not like that model. Like they'd rather go with some best of breed solutions and pull them all together. But, the vast majority of associations, I think, are resource constrained when it comes to technology. And they'd kind of like to have a one-stop shop where they can just wring one neck if their website isn't working, or the community isn't working, or their AMS isn't working, or their job board isn't working. Like if all of those things are wrapped up into one vendor, it becomes a lot easier to kind of go to one person and say, fix this. So I actually do think that we are going to see more consolidation in the market. I could see some other private equity firms look at what Community Brands has done and say, well, what's stopping us from going out and acquiring, 5 or 10 vendors and putting them all into one basket? So I happen to think that we will see consolidation. I wouldn't be surprised to see us land at a point maybe in 5 years where we've got 3 or 4 major players that own 80% or more of the market. And we might wind up in a position where we have like United, American, and Delta as like the big 3 players. We might see that in the association technology market too.